Daniel Reed hated paperwork more than he hated empty cargo holds. Right now, he had both problems at once. His freight hauler needed 3 more contracts to break even this month, and the Galactic Trading Authority wanted him to renew every single license and health certificate before he could dock anywhere civilized. So here he sat in the Medical Processing Center on Crossroads Beacon, surrounded by aliens who smelled like copper and flowers and things he couldn't identify, waiting for his turn in the scanner booth. The facility buzzed with activity. A family of tall, gray-skinned beings walked past, their children bouncing in the lower gravity. Nearby, something that looked like a walking crystal formation tapped at a data pad with limbs that grew directly from its body. Daniel had been in space long enough that none of this seemed strange anymore. He just wanted to get through the scan, collect his certification, and find a decent shipping contract before his fuel money ran out. Reed, Daniel, Booth 7. The automated voice spoke in perfect English, though Daniel knew it was probably speaking a dozen different languages to everyone else in the room. He stood and stretched, feeling his shoulders pop. The tattoos on both arms shifted with the movement, intricate geometric patterns that covered him from wrist to shoulder. His grandmother had given him the designs before she died, traditional patterns from their family's Pacific Islander heritage. He'd spent 2 years and way too much money getting them done properly on Earth. They meant something to him, connected him to a history that went back further than humanity's time in space. The scanner booth looked like every other medical scanner he'd seen, a white cylinder big enough to stand in, with soft blue lights running along the inside. Daniel stepped through the door and positioned himself on the marked spot. The machine hummed to life around him. "Please remain still during the scanning process," said the automated voice. "This will take approximately 40 seconds. Daniel relaxed and let his mind wander. He needed to check the job boards after this. Maybe something heading toward the inner systems where the pay was better. His ship could handle anything up to 40 tons, and he wasn't picky about cargo as long as it was legal. Well, mostly legal. He wasn't going to ask too many questions about sealed containers as long as the manifest looked legitimate. The scanner's hum changed pitch. Something in the sound made Daniel's skin prickle. The blue light suddenly flared red, and a harsh alarm began blaring throughout the entire medical center. Daniel stumbled backward as the scanner booth's door slammed shut in front of him, trapping him inside. What the hell? He pounded on the clear door, but it wouldn't budge. Warning lights flooded the booth with crimson illumination. Through the door, Daniel saw every person in the medical center freeze. Then as one, they all turned to stare at Booth 7. At him. The crystalline being he'd seen earlier dropped its data pad. The gray-skinned family gathered their children close, backing toward the exit. Someone screamed. The automated voice returned, but now it carried an edge of urgency that Daniel had never heard from a computer system before. Warning. Ancient warrior marks detected. Initiating security protocol Omega. All personnel evacuate to safe distance. Subject is to be contained until council authority arrives. Warrior marks. I'm a freight hauler. Daniel shouted at the scanner. These are just tattoos. Heavy security doors began descending throughout the facility. Daniel heard boots running toward his position. Through the booth's clear walls, he saw armed guards taking positions around him. They wore full combat armor and carried weapons that glowed with contained energy. Every single gun pointed at Booth 7. A tall figure pushed through the guards. It moved with careful, precise steps, its body composed of what looked like living glass in shades of amber and gold. One of the formed, Daniel recognized. Their species served as law enforcement throughout this sector. The crystalline face turned toward him, expressionless but somehow conveying disappointment and fear at the same time. Human, you are under detention by authority of the Galactic Council. Do not attempt to move. Do not attempt to communicate with anyone. Comply with all instructions immediately. The formed's voice resonated through the booth speakers. This is a mistake. Daniel kept his hands visible, trying not to look threatening while surrounded by enough firepower to vaporize his entire ship. I'm just here for my health certificate. The scanner does not make mistakes about these marks. The formed gestured at something Daniel couldn't see. Display the comparison. A holographic screen materialized in front of the booth. On one side, Daniel saw a clear scan of his left arm, every line and curve of his tattoos rendered in perfect detail. On the other side appeared an image that made his blood run cold. It showed what looked like ancient stone, carved with patterns that matched his tattoos almost exactly. Below that, Another image showed skeletal remains with similar markings still visible on the bone. The patterns on your body match the ceremonial combat marks of the predecessor warriors. The formed continued, a species that has been extinct for 50,000 years. A species that conquered 2/3 of this galaxy before their disappearance. A species whose marks are forbidden by galactic law to replicate, display, or possess. That's impossible. These are family designs from Earth. My grandmother. Your explanations will be recorded and analyzed by appropriate authorities. Until then, you will remain in containment. The formed turned away, already speaking into a communication device. Yes, confirmed. The patterns are authentic according to the database. I have never seen an active case in my lifetime. The council must be informed immediately. Daniel pressed his hands against the clear wall of the booth, watching the medical center empty. Everyone fled from him like he carried some deadly plague. In the corner, he saw news drones arriving, their cameras already transmitting. By tomorrow, his face would be on every information network in the sector. He looked down at his arms, at the tattoos he'd worn with pride for 5 years. They looked exactly the same as they always had. Flowing lines and geometric shapes, dots and curves that formed patterns his grandmother said represented navigation, family, and the ocean of stars their ancestors once crossed. She'd told him the designs went back hundreds of generations, preserved and passed down through their family line. 50,000 years, the formed had said. 2/3 of the galaxy, warriors whose very marks were forbidden. Daniel sank to the floor of the scanner booth, his mind racing. This had to be some kind of mistake. There was no way his family tattoos connected to an extinct alien species. Earth hadn't even known aliens existed until 200 years ago. Humans were new to the galactic community, insignificant compared to species that had been traveling between stars for millennia. But as he sat there, surrounded by armed guards and blaring alarms, watching more security forces arrive through the windows, Daniel felt something stir in the back of his mind, a strange sensation, like remembering a dream he'd never actually had. Images flickered at the edge of his consciousness. Stars arranged in patterns he'd never seen but somehow recognized. Distant voices speaking in languages he'd never heard but almost understood. He shook his head, trying to clear the thoughts. Stress and fear, nothing more, but the feeling wouldn't fade. And neither would the very real gun still pointed at his chest, waiting for him to become whatever threat the galaxy thought he represented. 3 hours passed before anyone spoke to Daniel again. He'd been moved from the scanner booth to an actual holding cell, though calling it a cell felt generous. The room was small, featureless, and made from the same clear material as the scanner booth. Guards stood visible on all sides, watching his every movement. They'd given him water and something that was supposed to be food but tasted like salted cardboard. Daniel ate it anyway, no telling when they'd feed him again. His mind kept returning to those strange flickers of memory that weren't his. The feeling had grown stronger in isolation, like static building before a storm. Sometimes he'd close his eyes and see vast star fields arranged in tactical formations. Other times he'd catch himself moving his hands in patterns that felt significant, but meaningless. Like his body remembered something his conscious mind had forgotten. A door materialized in the wall and a woman walked through. She was human, maybe 40 years old, with dark skin and gray beginning to show in her tightly braided hair. She wore the blue and silver uniform of Earth's diplomatic corps, but with additional insignia that marked her as something more. A xenoarchaeologist, Daniel realized, recognizing the symbols from educational programs he'd half-watched during long hauls between systems. Mr. Reed, I'm Dr. Imena Okoye. I specialize in extinct civilizations, particularly the predecessors. She sat down across from him without waiting for permission, placing a datapad on the table between them. I need to see your arms. Daniel hesitated, then pushed up his sleeves. The tattoos seemed to darken under her scrutiny, though that was probably just his imagination. Dr. Okoye pulled out a small scanning device and ran it slowly over each pattern, her expression growing more troubled with every passing second. Tell me about these designs. Where did you get them? My grandmother. She gave me the patterns before she died 6 years ago, said they were family tradition, going back as far as anyone could remember. I had them done on Earth by an artist who specialized in traditional Polynesian work. Daniel watched her scan his skin. What's going on? Those guards acted like I'm dangerous. You are dangerous, Mr. Reed. Or rather, what you represent is dangerous. Dr. Okoye set down her scanner and pulled up images on her datapad. Do you know what the predecessor civilization was? Only what everyone knows. Ancient species disappeared a long time ago, left ruins scattered across the galaxy. We studied them briefly in school. Daniel leaned forward. But they were aliens. They've got nothing to do with humans. That's what we all believed. Dr. Okoye turned the datapad to show him an image. It displayed a massive stone structure on some airless world, covered in carvings that matched his tattoos precisely. The predecessors didn't just disappear, Mr. Reed. They dominated this galaxy for thousands of years. Every species they encountered either submitted or was destroyed. They marked their victories through biological modification. These patterns you're wearing were grown into their skin using methods we still don't understand. Each set of marks represented battles won, worlds conquered, enemies eliminated. Daniel stared at the image, then at his arms. The similarities were undeniable. But that didn't make any sense. Earth was isolated. Humans didn't even know about other species until 2 centuries ago. How could we have these patterns? That's exactly what I need to find out. Dr. Okoye pulled up more images. Stone tablets covered in the same geometric designs. Cave paintings from different worlds, all showing the distinctive marks. Skeletal remains with patterns etched into bone. The predecessors vanished 50,000 years ago. Every trace of them went silent simultaneously across 2/3 of the galaxy. It's the greatest mystery in archaeological history. Where they went, why they left, whether they died or simply abandoned this region of space. She paused, meeting Daniel's eyes directly. What concerns the Galactic Council is the possibility that they didn't leave at all. That they're still here. The implications hit Daniel like cold water. You think humans are related to them? I think we need to find out. The Council has authorized an immediate investigation into human genetics, human history, and specifically into the origins of traditional marking practices across Earth's cultures. If there's a connection, we need to know. Dr. Okoye's voice softened slightly. I know this is overwhelming, but you need to understand how other species view the predecessors. They're the monsters parents use to scare children into behaving. The cautionary tales about unchecked aggression and conquest. Some species still haven't recovered from what the predecessors did to their worlds 50 millennia ago. And they think humans might be those monsters. Daniel felt sick. We've been part of galactic civilization for 200 years. We fought in joint defense forces. We've established trade relationships. We've formed friendships with dozens of species. Doesn't that count for anything? It counts for a lot, which is why you're sitting here talking to me instead of being killed on sight. But fear is a powerful thing, Mr. Reed, and you just triggered every ancient fear these species carry in their collective memory. Dr. Okoye started recording on her datapad. Tell me everything you know about your family history. Start with your grandmother. Daniel talked for over an hour. He told her about growing up on Earth, about his grandmother's stories of their ancestors crossing vast oceans in small boats, navigating by stars when others said it was impossible. He described how she'd kept detailed records of the family patterns, explaining each curve and line's meaning. Protection, guidance, memory of those who came before. The importance of knowing where you came from so you knew where you were going. Dr. Okoye recorded everything, occasionally asking questions or requesting clarification. When Daniel finished, she sat back with a troubled expression. Your grandmother said these patterns went back how many generations? She wasn't sure exactly. At least 40, maybe more. The records got fuzzy past a certain point, but the designs themselves stayed consistent. Daniel rubbed his arms unconsciously. Why? Because 40 generations is roughly 1,000 years. These patterns you're wearing haven't changed in at least a millennium, passed down through purely oral tradition and careful copying. That kind of cultural preservation is remarkable. She pulled up another image, but it doesn't explain this. The new image showed a stone carving recovered from a predecessor site. It depicted what looked like a star map, with specific systems marked by symbols. Below the map, a figure stood with arms outstretched, showing patterns identical to the ones on Daniel's right forearm. This was found on a dead world in the Outer Rim. The dating analysis says it's 47,000 years old. Dr. Okoye zoomed in on the figure. The predecessors didn't just mark themselves randomly. Each pattern encoded information: battle tactics, territorial claims, strategic value of conquered systems. They were living databases carrying critical information in their skin. Daniel felt that strange sensation again, the feeling of almost memory. He looked at his right arm, at the flowing patterns his grandmother had called navigation marks. In his mind, stars suddenly aligned with the curves, jump points marked by dots, trade routes flowing along the lines. It was all there, hiding in plain sight. "I think I can read them," he whispered. Dr. Okoye's eyes widened. "What did you say?" "The patterns. I think they mean something. I'm seeing—" Daniel struggled to put the sensation into words. "It's like looking at a map you've always known but forgot you knew. These marks on my arm, they're showing me star positions, systems, routes. That's impossible. You'd need genetic memory for that kind of recognition, and humans don't have—" Dr. Okoye stopped mid-sentence. "Unless we do. Unless that's exactly what we have, buried in our DNA, waiting for the right trigger to activate it." She stood abruptly, already calling someone on her communicator. "I need a full genetic analysis team here immediately, and get me access to the predecessor archives in the council library. All of them." Daniel sat alone again as she rushed out, leaving guards to watch him. He stared at his tattoos, seeing them differently now. Not just beautiful patterns passed down through family tradition, not just meaningless decoration. They were a language, a map, a key to understanding humanity's place in a much older and darker history. Somewhere in the back of his mind, voices whispered in languages 50,000 years dead, and Daniel realized with growing certainty that Dr. Okoye was right to be afraid. Because he was beginning to remember things no human should know. The genetic analysis took 6 days. Daniel spent them in isolation, though his cell had been upgraded to something resembling actual quarters. He had a proper bed, a bathroom, and a window that showed real stars instead of just blank walls. The guards remained, but they'd stopped pointing weapons at him constantly. Progress, he supposed. Dr. Okoye visited daily, bringing news from the investigation. Teams across Earth were scanning humans with traditional tattoos from dozens of cultures. Maori, Celtic, Norse, various African tribes, indigenous peoples from both American continents. The results were all the same. The patterns matched predecessor designs with impossible accuracy. Some were exact copies. Others were variations but clearly derived from the same source material. The news networks had exploded with speculation. Daniel's face appeared on every channel, usually accompanied by inflammatory headlines about humanity's secret past. Some called for calm and scientific investigation. Others demanded that humans be expelled from galactic civilization immediately, quarantined back to Earth before they could awaken whatever dormant violence supposedly lurked in their genes. On the 7th day, Dr. Okoye arrived with a grim expression and 2 armed escorts that Daniel hadn't seen before. These weren't regular station security. They wore the black and gold of Council Special Forces. "We're taking a trip," she said simply. "Get your things." Daniel owned exactly 3 changes of clothes and a data pad the guards had grudgingly returned to him. He gathered them in under a minute. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere that might give us answers. Or get us both killed. I haven't decided which is more likely." Dr. Okoye led him through corridors he'd never seen, deeper into the station's restricted sections. "The Council has authorized an expedition to a predecessor ruin site. They want to see how you react to direct exposure to their technology. And if I suddenly turn into some kind of ancient killing machine, then my escorts have orders to terminate you immediately." She said it matter-of-factly, without emotion. I argued against this plan. "You're not military. You're not trained for this kind of situation. But the Council is desperate for answers. Fear is spreading fast, Daniel. 2 member species have already recalled their ambassadors from Earth. Trade routes are being closed. If we don't find proof that humans are harmless or at least controllable, we're looking at a potential war." They boarded a small, fast ship that had been cleared for immediate departure. The journey would take 4 days through multiple jump points. Daniel spent most of that time in his cabin, though Dr. Okoye occasionally invited him to her workspace to review predecessor historical records. The more he learned, the worse it got. The predecessors hadn't just conquered. They'd perfected it. They developed weapons that could crack planets, ships that moved faster than anything modern species could build, and biological enhancements that made them nearly impossible to kill. They'd ruled through absolute force, offering species a simple choice: submit completely or face extermination. But something had changed. In the last 1,000 years of their dominance, records showed the predecessors pulling back from active conquest. They'd stopped expanding, stopped crushing rebellions with their usual efficiency. Some ruins contained writings that suggested internal conflict, philosophical debates about the purpose of their empire, and then suddenly they were gone. Every world, every ship, every trace of their civilization simply vanished within a span of just 10 years. What do you think happened to them? Daniel asked during one late-night review session. Dr. Okoye didn't look up from her holographic displays. I used to think they destroyed themselves. Civil war, some weapon that got out of control. But the ruins don't show signs of that kind of destruction. Everything was just abandoned, left intact and empty. She finally met his eyes. Now I think they left on purpose. The question is where they went and why. The ship dropped out of its final jump into a system with no name, just a catalog designation. A single dead world orbited a dim red star. Sensors showed no atmosphere, no life, no activity of any kind. Just ancient ruins covering approximately 30% of the surface. They landed near the largest structure, a massive pyramidal building that had somehow survived 50,000 years of vacuum and radiation. The council escorts secured the perimeter, while Dr. Okoye and Daniel suited up for the surface. The suits felt heavy and restrictive, but Daniel had worked in them before during cargo operations. He knew how to move. Stepping out onto the alien surface felt surreal. The ruins stretched in every direction, geometric patterns carved into stone that shouldn't have survived this long. The buildings followed no architectural style Daniel recognized, all sharp angles and impossible overhangs that seemed to defy physics. Everything was covered in the same flowing patterns that decorated his arms. The structure should be pressurized inside, Dr. Okoye said through the suit radio. Predecessor buildings had self-maintaining systems. Most still work, at least partially. They entered through an opening that might have been a door. Inside, dim lights activated automatically, responding to their presence. The interior was vast, with ceilings that disappeared into darkness and walls covered floor to ceiling with carved patterns. Daniel felt his skin prickle even through the suit. Those strange memories intensified, flooding his mind with images and sensations. He'd been here before, not him personally, but someone whose memories he carried. He knew which corridor led to the command center, which rooms contained weapon systems where the living quarters had been. The knowledge was just there, as natural as knowing his own name. Daniel, your biosigns are spiking. What's happening? Dr. Okoye's voice sounded distant despite being right next to him. I know this place. He walked forward without thinking, following paths laid down in memory 50,000 years old. Someone who looked like me stood here, walked these halls. They were waiting for something. A decision. The patterns on the walls began to glow. Soft blue light spread through the carvings, following lines that matched the tattoos on Daniel's arms. Dr. Okoye gasped behind him. The escorts raised their weapons but held fire. Daniel reached the central chamber and stopped. A holographic display flickered to life in the room's center. Images appeared, showing what looked like a council chamber not unlike the Galactic Council of today. But these figures were unmistakably human. Different clothing, different styling, but the same basic features. The same body structure. Some wore elaborate versions of the marking patterns on their skin, glowing with that same blue light. The hologram shifted, showing space battles of incredible scale, fleets beyond counting, weapons that could shatter moons. Then the images changed again, showing something else. Humans gathering in massive groups, their expressions troubled. Arguments, discussions, a sense of profound dissatisfaction despite apparent victory. They were debating whether to continue, Daniel heard himself say, though he wasn't sure if the words were his own or echoes from genetic memory. They'd conquered so much and it meant nothing. Each victory felt more hollow. They realized they'd become something they didn't want to be. A final image appeared, a star map showing Earth primitive and isolated. The hologram displayed ships heading toward it, carrying what looked like colonists. The marked warriors were removing their enhancements, stripping away their advanced genetics, choosing to become something simpler. They went home, Dr. Okoye breathed. The predecessors didn't disappear. They went back to Earth and started over. Not all of them, Daniel corrected, still speaking from that place of ancient knowledge. Just those who wanted to remember what it meant to be human without all the power. They called it the Great Undoing. They scattered themselves across Earth's continents, embedding their memories in cultural traditions so their descendants would remember the mistakes even if they forgot the details. The hologram expanded, showing more details. Instructions for how the marks should be preserved, teaching methods to ensure the cultural memory survived, and warnings encoded in the patterns themselves. Warnings about what happens when power becomes an end rather than a means, when conquest replaces purpose. The marks weren't meant to threaten anyone, Daniel said softly. They were meant to remind us, to make sure we never forgot the cost of what our ancestors did. The hologram froze on a final image, a single human figure with arms spread wide, displaying marks identical to Daniel's. Below it, text in a language that had been dead for 50 millennia. But Daniel could read it now, the meaning clear in his mind. We who conquered learned too late that victory means nothing without wisdom. May our children build what we could not. May they remember us not as warriors but as those who chose to start again. The lights faded. The hologram disappeared. Daniel stood in the darkness, tears running down his face inside his helmet. He understood now. Understood what his grandmother had tried to tell him. The patterns weren't about pride or heritage in the way he'd thought. They were a memorial, a permanent reminder carved into flesh and passed through generations that power without purpose was worse than no power at all. Dr. Okoye's voice came through the radio, shaken but determined. We need to get this recording back to the council. This changes everything. News of the hologram recording reached the Galactic Council before Daniel's ship finished its return journey. By the time they docked at Crossroads Beacon, everything had changed. Half the member species were calling for immediate sanctions against Earth. The other half were split between those who believed the predecessor message and those who thought it was an elaborate deception. Daniel found himself moved to new quarters. These ones decidedly more comfortable, but just as heavily guarded. The council had scheduled an emergency session in 3 days, and he'd been summoned to testify. Dr. Okoye spent hours preparing him for questions, explaining the political landscape he was stepping into. You need to understand that some species have been waiting for humans to reveal their true nature, she explained during one prep session. The formed in particular have long memories. The predecessors devastated their homeworld. They see humans as an existential threat, and your revelation has confirmed their worst fears. But we're not the predecessors. We've been peaceful for 2 centuries. Daniel rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building. The genetic memories had been getting stronger since their visit to the ruins. Sometimes he'd lose minutes at a time, lost in visions of battles and decisions made 50,000 years ago. 200 years is nothing on a galactic timescale. Many species live for centuries. They remember when humans first arrived, aggressive and territorial despite our technological disadvantages. We've started 3 wars in that time, even if they were quickly resolved. Defensive wars, Daniel protested. We were protecting colony worlds from raiders, which we won decisively despite being numerically inferior and less technologically advanced. That scared people, Daniel. It made them wonder what humans could do if we actually wanted to conquer instead of just defend. Dr. Okoye pulled up reports on her datapad, and now, with this revelation about our genetic heritage, every instance of human aggression is being re-examined as evidence of predecessor programming awakening. The door chimed. A council messenger arrived with formal documents requiring Daniel's signature. He was being granted temporary diplomatic status, which meant he couldn't be detained anymore, but also couldn't leave council space until the hearings concluded. He signed without bothering to read the fine print. What choice did he have? That night Daniel couldn't sleep. He stood at his window watching ships come and go from the station, trying to process everything that had happened. 2 weeks ago, he'd been a simple freight hauler worried about finding his next cargo contract. Now he was somehow representing all of humanity in a trial that could determine whether his species remained part of galactic civilization or got expelled back to isolated Earth. His communicator buzzed. An incoming call from an unknown source. Daniel almost ignored it, but something made him answer. Mr. Reed. The voice was digitally distorted, impossible to identify. You are in danger. The council session is a trap. Daniel's blood ran cold. Who is this? Someone who understands what's really happening. The extremists aren't waiting for the council's decision. They plan to destroy Earth before humans can fully awaken their genetic heritage. The attack fleet launches in 4 days. That's insane. The council would never allow. The Council doesn't know. This is being organized by radical elements from multiple species, all united by fear of the predecessors returning. They see this as a preventive strike, eliminating the threat before it fully emerges. The voice paused. You need to warn Earth's defense forces, and you need to survive long enough to testify, because there will be attempts on your life before you reach that hearing. The connection terminated. Daniel immediately tried to trace the call but got nowhere. He contacted Dr. Okoye and relayed the warning. She believed him, or at least took the threat seriously enough to request additional security. Within an hour, Council Intelligence Services had locked down the entire section of the station where Daniel was staying. The investigation uncovered evidence of a plot within 24 hours. A maintenance worker had smuggled an explosive device into the station's environmental systems, positioned to release a toxin that would specifically target human biology. The device had been hours from activation. Security arrested 12 suspects, all members of species that had suffered heavily under predecessor rule. But the damage was done. News of the assassination attempt spread instantly. Pro-human and anti-human factions began clashing across the galaxy. 3 ships were destroyed in what authorities called isolated incidents, but everyone knew were targeted attacks. Earth's government placed all military forces on high alert. Dr. Okoye looked exhausted when she visited Daniel the next morning. It's falling apart faster than anyone predicted. The Council is moving the hearing up to tomorrow. They want this resolved before we have a full-scale war. Can we even prove humans are safe? I'm carrying memories of ancient battles. What if the extremists are right? What if being exposed to predecessor sites is going to activate something dangerous in humans? Daniel had been wrestling with that fear himself. The genetic memories were getting more vivid. Sometimes he caught himself moving like a soldier, thinking tactically about his surroundings, seeing everything as potential threat or opportunity. Then we deal with it. But we do it based on evidence and reason, not fear. Dr. Okoye pulled up new data on her pad. I've been analyzing the predecessor message from the ruins. There's something we missed initially. The Great Undoing wasn't just about starting over. It was about encoding specific psychological limitations into human genetics. She displayed complex genetic charts. The predecessors modified their own DNA before settling on Earth. They made themselves forget advanced technology, yes, but they also enhanced certain traits that would prevent them from falling back into the same patterns. Stronger empathy responses, greater capacity for cooperation, increased aversion to unnecessary violence. The marks we carry activate those enhancements when exposed to the right stimuli. You're saying the genetic memories make us less violent, not more. I'm saying your ancestors knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't just hide themselves on Earth. They deliberately redesigned humanity to be better than the predecessors were. Every time you feel that pull toward those ancient memories, you're also feeling the safeguards they built in. The guilt, the regret, the determination to choose differently. Daniel looked at his arms, seeing the patterns in yet another new light. Not weapons, not threats, safeguards. His ancestors had turned themselves into a living warning system, ensuring their descendants would never forget the cost of unchecked power. Does the Council know this? They will tomorrow. I am presenting it as part of your testimony. Dr. Okoye smiled grimly. Whether they believe it is another question. Fear makes people irrational, Daniel. Even presented with evidence, some species will still see humans as threats, simply because we have the potential for violence. That night, Daniel received another message from the unknown source. This one was brief. The attack fleet is launching tonight. They can reach Earth in 6 days. Warn your people. Protect your homeworld. Daniel immediately contacted Earth's military command through Council channels. They confirmed increased activity in border regions, ships moving toward human space from multiple directions. Within hours, Earth's entire defense network mobilized. Patrol ships moved to intercept courses. Orbital defense platforms powered up for the first time in decades. Every human colony went on alert status. The galaxy was sliding toward war, and Daniel stood at the center of it all. In less than 12 hours, he would face the Galactic Council and try to convince them that humanity deserved to remain part of their civilization. That the descendants of the galaxy's greatest conquerors had truly changed. He spent the remaining time reviewing his testimony with Dr. Okoye, going over every possible question and challenge. But as dawn approached, Daniel realized that no amount of preparation would be enough. The council wanted certainty. They wanted proof that humans would never become what the predecessors had been, and Daniel couldn't give them that. Because he'd learned enough about human history to know the truth. Humans were capable of both great violence and great compassion. They could build or destroy with equal efficiency. The genetic modifications his ancestors had made helped, but they didn't guarantee anything. Humans still had to choose every day to be better than their worst impulses. That was the message he'd carry to the council. Not promises of inherent goodness or guarantees of eternal peace, just the truth that humanity had been given a choice by their own ancestors. And so far they'd mostly chosen well. It would have to be enough. The council chamber was far larger than Daniel had imagined. The room stretched upward for what looked like hundreds of meters, with seating arranged in spiraling tiers that accommodated the wildly different body types of member species. Thousands of representatives filled the space, creating a wall of eyes all focused on the small platform where Daniel stood. He wore simple clothes, his tattooed arms fully visible under the bright lights. Dr. Okoye sat nearby at a designated expert witness station, ready to provide technical clarification if needed. The armed guards who'd accompanied them stood at attention by the exits, though whether they were there to protect Daniel or stop him from escaping remained unclear. The council speaker, a floating sphere of contained energy from a species called the Radiant, addressed the assembly. Its voice resonated through every being present, a form of telepathic communication that translated perfectly into each listener's native understanding. This emergency session addresses the status of humanity within our galactic community. New evidence suggests humans are genetic descendants of the predecessor warriors, an extinct species responsible for countless atrocities across this region of space. We gather to determine whether humanity poses a threat requiring intervention, and if so, what form that intervention should take. A holographic display materialized, showing Daniel's tattoos alongside images from predecessor ruins. The similarities were damning. Murmurs spread through the chamber, sounds of fear and anger mixing together. The human known as Daniel Reed will provide testimony regarding these marks and their significance. Following his statement, representatives may question him directly. The council will then vote on humanity's continued membership status. The speaker's energy pulsed. "Mr. Reed, you may begin." Daniel's mouth felt dry despite the water he'd drunk minutes before. He saw faces in the crowd. Some looked curious, others terrified, many hostile. He thought about his grandmother, about the stories she'd told him while teaching him the meaning behind each pattern on his skin. He thought about his ship waiting in dock, the cargo contracts he'd never filled, the simple life he'd been living before that medical scanner changed everything. He thought about Earth, about billions of humans going about their lives unaware that their entire future hung on what he said in this chamber. "I'm a freight hauler," he began, his voice amplified throughout the space. 2 weeks ago, my biggest concern was finding enough work to pay for fuel and food. I knew I had tattoos. I knew they were important to my family, but I had no idea they connected to anything beyond Earth. He raised his arms, displaying the patterns fully. These marks were given to me by my grandmother. She learned them from her grandmother, who learned them from hers going back as far as anyone in my family can remember. We kept these patterns alive for one reason. We were told never to forget where we came from. Daniel paused, gathering his thoughts. You call them kill marks, war patterns, symbols of conquest. And you're right. That's what they were, 50,000 years ago. The predecessors wore these marks with pride, each one representing a victory, a world conquered, an enemy destroyed. They perfected war. They ruled through fear and superior force. They were unstoppable. The chamber remained silent, every being focused on his words. But something changed. The predecessors realized that conquest for its own sake was empty. That power without purpose led nowhere. So they made an impossible choice. They gave it all up. They went back to Earth, stripped away their enhancements, and started over as something simpler. Daniel's voice grew stronger, but they didn't forget. They couldn't afford to forget. So they encoded the memories into their genes and preserved the patterns in their cultures, not as celebrations but as warnings. A representative from the formed stood, its crystalline body flashing with agitation. You expect us to believe the predecessors simply chose peace? That the species which destroyed my people's homeworld decided to become harmless? No, Daniel said firmly. I don't expect you to believe they became harmless. Because that would be a lie. Humans are capable of violence. We've fought wars on Earth for our entire history. We've caused suffering and destruction. We're not gentle by nature. The admission caused ripples through the chamber. Dr. Okoye looked worried, but Daniel continued. But capability isn't the same as inevitability. Yes, we can be violent. We have that capacity. But we also have the capacity to choose not to be. The predecessors understood that. They didn't try to breed violence out of their descendants. They just gave us the tools to remember why we shouldn't choose it casually. Another representative stood, this one from a species Daniel didn't recognize. You speak of choice, but your genetic memories are awakening. We've seen the reports. You're remembering ancient battles, tactical knowledge, predecessor technology. What happens when all humans awaken? When every person on Earth suddenly recalls how to build planet-cracking weapons, then we'll have to choose not to build them. Daniel met the representative's gaze directly. The knowledge is there, yes, but so is the guilt, the regret. Every time I access those memories, I feel what my ancestors felt at the end, the emptiness of their victories, the horror at what they'd become. You think remembering how to build weapons is dangerous. I remember why they abandoned those weapons. I remember the look on faces of people whose worlds we destroyed. I remember the moment my ancestors realized they'd become monsters. He turned to address the full council. You want guarantees. You want me to promise that humans will never become a threat. I can't give you that. No species can. Any of you could become dangerous under the right circumstances. The predecessors proved that power itself isn't evil, but it can corrupt even the best intentions. Daniel's voice dropped, becoming more intimate despite the massive space. What I can tell you is this: we remember. Every human with these marks carries that memory. We pass it down through generations not as something to aspire to, but as something to guard against. We're the descendants of the galaxy's greatest conquerors, yes, but we're also the descendants of those who chose to stop conquering. A new figure stood in the upper tiers. This one spoke with authority that silenced the murmurs. The human presents pretty words, but we face a practical question. A fleet of extremists is moving toward Earth as we speak, intent on destroying humanity before the awakening completes. If we intervene to stop them, we validate human membership in this council. If we don't, we condemn billions to death. What would you have us do, Mr. Reed? Daniel felt every eye on him. This was the real test. How would humanity respond to an existential threat? Would they reach for those ancient weapons? Would the genetic memories trigger a predecessor-level response? I would have you act according to your laws and principles, Daniel said carefully. An unprovoked attack on any member world should be stopped through whatever means necessary. Not because I'm asking for special treatment, but because that's how civilized species behave. And if the attack succeeds, the speaker pressed, if Earth is destroyed before we can intervene, what would surviving humans do with their predecessor knowledge and freshly awakened rage? The question hung in the air like a blade. Daniel thought about his ship, about his friends on Earth, about the life he'd built. He thought about losing everything to fear and violence. I don't know, he admitted. Some would want revenge. Some would rage and threaten. The genetic memories include knowledge of weapons terrible enough to crack this station in half. In that moment of grief and fury, accessing that knowledge would be easy. The chamber erupted in alarm. Guards moved closer to the platform. But Daniel raised his voice above the chaos. But that's not the whole story, because the genetic memories also include what came after. The regret. The realization that revenge solves nothing. The understanding that violence only creates more violence. He looked at his arms again, at the patterns that had caused all of this. My ancestors gave us more than knowledge of how to destroy. They gave us the knowledge of why we shouldn't. And that knowledge is just as strong, just as deeply embedded in our genes. Dr. Okoye stood, adding her voice. If I may, Council Speaker, our genetic analysis confirms Mr. Reed's testimony. The predecessor modifications include enhanced empathy responses and increased psychological resistance to dehumanization of perceived enemies. The awakening doesn't just restore ancient knowledge, it also reinforces the emotional and ethical framework that led to the Great Undoing. The council speaker pulsed with light. You're describing a species designed to balance violence with wisdom. But balance can fail. What prevents humans from tipping toward their violent heritage? Daniel met the speaker's gaze directly. The same thing that prevents you. Choice. Consciousness. The daily decision to be better than our worst impulses. You're asking me to prove humans are safe. I can't, but I can prove that we're trying. 200 years of mostly peaceful interaction should count for something. We're not perfect, but we're learning. The chamber fell into discussion, thousands of voices arguing in dozens of languages. Daniel stood on the platform exhausted and uncertain. He'd said everything he could think to say, given them the truth as he understood it. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen. The voting would come next, and with it the fate of humanity. The council deliberated for 18 hours. Daniel waited in a secured room with Dr. Okoye, watching news feeds that showed the galaxy tearing itself apart. The extremist fleet had been intercepted by council forces before reaching Earth, but fighting had broken out across multiple systems. Species who supported humanity clashed with those who wanted them expelled. Trade routes collapsed. Diplomatic relations shattered. 2 centuries of careful peace unraveling in days. Daniel barely slept. The genetic memories had intensified during his testimony, flooding his mind with images of similar moments from 50,000 years ago. He saw his ancestors standing before councils of conquered species demanding submission. He felt their certainty that power gave them the right to rule. But he also felt their gradual disillusionment, the slow realization that ruling through fear meant living in a cage of their own making. "You should eat something," Dr. Okoye said, pushing a meal tray toward him. Daniel ignored it. What if I'm wrong? What if the genetic safeguards aren't enough? There are 8 billion humans on Earth. What if even a small percentage wake up and decide they want to rebuild the predecessor empire? Then we'll deal with it. But you can't plan for every worst-case scenario, Daniel. At some point you have to trust that people will make the right choices. She sat across from him. I've spent my career studying the predecessors. You know what always struck me? They didn't fall because they were defeated. They fell because they defeated themselves. They looked at what they'd built and saw nothing worth keeping. That took incredible courage, or incredible guilt, maybe both. Maybe that's what wisdom is. Understanding the weight of your actions and choosing to live with that weight, rather than inflicting it on others. Dr. Okoye smiled slightly. Your ancestors weren't perfect, but they were trying to be better. That's all any of us can do. The summons came at dawn. The council had reached a decision. Daniel walked back to the chamber feeling numb, almost disconnected from his own body. The genetic memories whispered strategies for fighting his way out if the vote went badly. Tactical assessments of guard positions and weapon placements. He pushed the thoughts away, focusing on his grandmother's voice instead. The stories she'd told him about choosing peace even when violence seemed easier. The chamber was more crowded than before. Every seat filled, with more beings watching through holographic feeds from across the galaxy. Daniel took his position on the platform. The armed guards remained close, weapons ready. The council speaker floated above the assembly, its energy form pulsing with what might have been tension. The council has deliberated on the question of humanity's status within our galactic community. This decision required extensive debate and compromise among member species. The vote was close, with significant opposition remaining. Daniel's heart hammered. He looked up at thousands of alien faces, trying to read their expressions. However, a majority has concluded that humanity should retain membership status, subject to specific conditions and ongoing monitoring. The speaker's voice resonated through the chamber. This decision is based on multiple factors. First, the evidence presented regarding predecessor genetic modifications suggests built-in safeguards against uncontrolled aggression. Second, humanity's behavior over 2 centuries has been largely consistent with peaceful integration. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the testimony of Daniel Reed demonstrated the kind of self-awareness and ethical consideration that suggests humans understand the weight of their heritage. Relief flooded through Daniel, so intense it made him dizzy. But the speaker wasn't finished. The conditions are as follows. First, all humans displaying predecessor marks must register with the council and undergo regular psychological evaluation. Second, Earth must share all research regarding genetic awakening and predecessor knowledge with council scientific authorities. Third, human expansion into new systems will be limited pending further study of population-wide genetic activation. Fourth, a council observation team will maintain permanent presence in human space to monitor for signs of concerning behavior patterns. The restrictions were harsh, intrusive even, but they weren't expulsion. They weren't extermination. Daniel could work with restrictions. Additionally, the speaker continued, the council recognizes that fear and misunderstanding led to the recent attacks against humanity. Reparations will be paid to affected human colonies, and species involved in unauthorized military action will face sanctions. We cannot prevent violence through more violence. We must choose to trust in our shared capacity for growth and change. The chamber erupted in mixed reactions. Some species cheered. Others protested loudly. The formed representative stormed out, its crystalline body flashing with rage. But the decision was made. Humanity would remain. Daniel stood on the platform, tears streaming down his face. He thought about his grandmother, wished she could have lived to see this moment. She'd known what the patterns meant, had understood the risk in preserving them. But she'd done it anyway because some knowledge was too important to lose, even when keeping it was dangerous. The speaker addressed him directly. Mr. Reed, you have become a symbol whether you desired it or not. Your testimony and conduct have influenced this council's decision. We charge you with a new responsibility. You will serve as official liaison between humanity and the council's monitoring program. You will help us understand what it means when your people awaken to their heritage. Daniel wanted to refuse. He wanted to go back to his ship, back to running cargo and living simply. But he thought about all those humans carrying marks they didn't fully understand, about the responsibility his ancestors had passed down, about the choice to bear the weight rather than run from it. I accept, he said. The session concluded. Daniel was immediately surrounded by diplomatic staff, media representatives, and security personnel. Dr. Okoye managed to extract him from the crowd, leading him to a quieter space where they could actually breathe. You did well, she said. Better than I expected, honestly. You gave them truth instead of promises. That mattered. What happens now? Now the real work begins. Registering marked humans, developing protocols for genetic awakening, building trust with species who still see us as threats. She pulled up her datapad, already showing messages from Earth. The diplomatic corps wants you to tour human colonies, explain the situation, help people understand what their marks really mean. Are you up for that? Daniel looked at his arms, at the patterns that had seemed so simple just weeks ago. Ancient kill marks, the medical scanner had called them. But they were so much more than that. They were memory and warning, heritage and choice, violence and wisdom all woven together in flowing geometric designs. Yeah, he said, I'm up for it. Over the following months, Daniel traveled throughout human space. He met with people bearing marks from dozens of cultural traditions. Maori warriors with intricate facial designs, Celtic families with knotwork covering their backs, Norse descendants wearing runes and patterns their ancestors had carried for millennia, indigenous peoples from every continent, all carrying pieces of the same ancient message encoded in different cultural languages. Some were terrified to learn the truth. They had their marks removed, wanting nothing to do with the predecessor heritage. Daniel understood. Not everyone could carry that weight, but others embraced it. They studied their patterns, worked with xenoarchaeologists to decode the meanings. They reported dreams and memories similar to Daniel's, fragmented images of lives lived 50,000 years ago. The council's psychological teams monitored them all carefully, watching for signs of dangerous behavioral changes. None appeared. The genetic safeguards held. Yes, people gained knowledge they hadn't possessed before. Yes, they experienced memories of violence and conquest. But they also experienced the regret, the wisdom, the eventual understanding that had led the predecessors to abandon their empire. The two came together, inseparable. A year after the council vote, Daniel stood in a museum on Earth. The building housed predecessor artifacts recovered from ruins across the galaxy, brought together for study and public education. A new exhibit had opened, explaining the connection between ancient patterns and human cultural traditions. Families walked through the displays, children asking questions about the strange symbols carved into alien stone. Parents explained as best they could about ancestors from so long ago that they seemed mythological. About choices made across deep time, about the responsibility of remembering. Daniel stood before a particular artifact, a stone tablet recovered from the ruin site he'd visited. It showed the image he remembered from the hologram, the figure with outstretched arms displaying marks identical to his own. The translation placard explained the inscription beneath it. We who conquered learned too late that victory means nothing without wisdom. May our children build what we could not. May they remember us not as warriors, but as those who chose to start again. A young girl approached, maybe 8 years old. She stared at Daniel's arms, then at the tablet, making the connection. "Your marks match," she said. "Did you know the old warriors?" Daniel smiled. "In a way. They were my ancestors. And yours too, probably. Were they bad people?" The question deserved an honest answer. They did bad things. Hurt a lot of people, but they realized they were wrong and tried to make it right. That's what the marks are for. To help us remember. Remember what? That we always have a choice. That being strong doesn't mean being cruel. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose peace when violence would be easier. Daniel knelt to her level. "Do you understand?" The girl thought about it, her young face serious. "I think so. Like how my brother and I fight sometimes, but we don't have to." "Exactly like that. But bigger." She nodded and ran off to rejoin her family. Daniel stood looking at the tablet again. His genetic memories had settled into something he could live with. A background presence rather than an overwhelming flood. He could access predecessor knowledge when he needed it, but it didn't control him. The choice remained his every day, every moment. His communicator buzzed. A message from the council. They'd discovered another major predecessor site and wanted his presence during initial exploration. The work continued. It might always continue. Understanding 50,000 years of history didn't happen overnight. But Daniel had time. Humanity had time. They'd proven they could carry their heritage without being consumed by it. They'd shown the galaxy that knowledge of violence didn't require choosing violence. That memory of conquest didn't mean repeating conquest. He left the museum and headed for the spaceport. His ship waited, cargo already loaded for the trip to the new ruin site. Dr. Okoye would meet him there, along with research teams from a dozen species. Working together, building trust. Choosing cooperation over conflict. Daniel looked up at the sky, at stars his ancestors had once conquered. They looked different now, not targets or territory, just stars. Places to explore, to learn from, to share with others. He touched his arms, feeling the patterns under his fingers. Ancient kill marks, the scanner had said. But that wasn't quite right. They were something better than that. Something his grandmother had understood even without knowing the full history. They were reminders, permanent warnings carved into flesh and passed through generations, not about what humans had been, but about what they'd chosen not to be anymore, about the daily work of being better than your worst impulses, about carrying the weight of history without being crushed by it. Daniel boarded his ship and set course for distant stars. The journey continued. The choice remained, and that, he'd learned, was exactly how it should be.